Directorate S, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan, 2001 to 2016, by Steve Coll. Now, this book, published in 2018, has got serious analytical issues. A leading US Israeli intelligence analyst and operator recently summed up pathetic state of the US intelligence operators in Pakistan as following: quote, "They are afraid of their own shadows," unquote. As great powers decline, their quality of strategic judgment and decision making and their operational effectiveness also markedly declines. Steve Coll's voluminous and bulky book reconfirms this fact. The first defect of this book is that it does not contain a single relevant map connected to the subject, that is Directorate S. On page 12, the writer repeats a false and unsubstantiated claim that CIA pilots had to fly Russian Mi series helicopters for the Northern Alliance, whereas in reality Afghanistan never had any shortage of Afghan helicopter pilots. On page 14, the author confirms his absolute lack of knowledge of geography when he fallaciously claims that Panjshir Valley slices north towards Tajikistan, whereas in reality Panjshir Valley inclines towards Chitral in Pakistan, towards the northeast, ending at the Anjuman Pass, which I had the good or bad luck to cross and recross various times. The author's analysis is a clear testament of fallacious assessments of US policy makers about Afghanistan, like on page 17. He discusses Al Qaeda and US policy makers' obsession with Al Qaeda. As a matter of fact, Al Qaeda was never the real player in Afghanistan all along. It was a puny group, if it existed at all, with limited strategic ability. The real players in Afghanistan all along were Taliban, supported by Directorate S of the ISI. This basic perceptual error repeatedly appears in Steve Coll's voluminous narrative, and Steve Coll himself is quite confused about it. Steve Coll's factually flawed statement, like page 17, where he states, quote, "Recalling the miserable fates of Imperial Britain while referring to Britain's Afghan wars, why Coll has to make such baseless statements is perplexing. As a matter of fact, all three Afghan wars were a strategic success, first being waged by a British private company. All three Afghan wars made British strategic position in India and West Asia stronger and created a more stable Afghanistan. I guess it is fashionable in Western authors to make such statements about what a terrible place Afghanistan was and is. Nowhere does the author analyze that every intelligence agency generates warnings about likely attacks so that its reputation and credibility is protected when one attack occurs. In the tank corps, we call it speculative fire. On page 37, Steve Coll admits that 9/11 was a CIA intelligence failure. Page 38 discusses the interesting finding that an inquiry board in 2005 recommended action against Coffer Black for failing to perform up to the professional standards at the time of 9/11. Steve Coll nowhere analyzes why and how Al Qaeda succeeded in 9/11 attacks but could never repeat this performance. On page 41, Steve Coll discusses inflated perceptions in the CIA about Afghanistan, where Coffer Black thinks that 4 or 5 dozen CIA personnel may perish in the planned attack on Afghanistan in late 2001. Al Qaeda is all along exalted by Steve Coll to a very high pedestal. Like on page 50, he discusses that US policymakers feared an alliance between Al Qaeda and the Pakistani state. On page 54, Coll starts fabricating Pakistani history absolutely, baselessly, when he states that General Musharraf was awarded a gallantry award for action behind Indian lines in 1971. Absolute nonsense, claim of Coll, whereas in reality Musharraf never saw any action in 1971 Indo-Pak war. This false statement was first mentioned in Steve Coll's book and now repeated in the book under review. I interviewed General Musharraf's commanding officer, Brigadier Iqbal Nazir Wadaich, now settled in Canada, in 2005, and he dismissed this assertion of Steve Coll as absolutely baseless nonsense. As you can see, this is the commanding officer of General Musharraf in the 1971 war, Brigadier Iqbal Nazir Wadaich, an outstanding Special Forces officer trained at the Fort Bragg, and Brigadier Iqbal Nazir Wadaich, Musharraf's commanding officer in the 3 Commando Battalion in 1971 India-Pakistan war, categorically denied that Musharraf saw any action in 1971 war. However, Steve Coll repeated this chronic lie in his 2018 new book Directorate S. As you can see, this is a March 2018 photograph. Brigadier Iqbal Nazir Wadaich since then has expired. God bless his great soul, a very dear friend of my father. Now, Coll is master in exaggeration and spicing his narrative, but nowhere rationalizes as to why the US forces suffered only one fatal casualty in the actual US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and that too a non-military CIA specialist, whereas Coll leaves no stone unturned to portray Al Qaeda as a very dangerous adversary. Pearls of nonsense from Coll. I agree with Coll's observation on page 64 that the ISI was a master in manipulating both the USA and the Taliban. Page 83 contains an interesting example of CIA inefficiency, where CIA was adamant on bombing a place whose coordinates had already been passed to CIA as a US position. On page 88, Steve Coll fallaciously claims that ISI subject shifted its covert action headquarters to OGD camp in 2001, whereas OGD camp was ISI covert action headquarters as early as 80s and 90s. All along the narrative, the US fallacy of regarding Al-Qaeda as the strategic objective of Afghan war recurs and is repeated by Steve Coll, while in reality the real players in US Afghan war were the ISI and its Afghan Taliban proxies. The Al-Qaeda was a bogey and a much inflated and misused term. Like on page 102, Coll states, the objective of Operation Enduring Freedom was not to seize Al-Qaeda, it was not to seize Kabul, it was to destroy Al-Qaeda. This remained the cornerstone of the totally flawed strategy in Afghanistan. As we saw, Al-Qaeda did exist but was a minor player, and apart from 9/11, there is hardly any significant feather that can be attached to the cap of Al-Qaeda, and 9/11 also remains a massively complicated affair. On page 105, Coll discusses total lack of resolution of US General Delhi during the Tora Bora attack. On the same page, as per Coll's analysis, General Tommy Franks stands out as a typical no risk, no boldness, hole puncher, a typical windbag general, Tommy Franks. On page 107, Steve Coll fallaciously places Tora Bora in the Hindu Kush mountain range, whereas Tora Bora had absolutely no connection with the Hindu Kush mountain range. Dick Cheney's assessments, as discussed on the page 110, that the war in Afghanistan may spill out to Pakistan and endanger Pakistan's nuclear arsenal may be endangered, stands out as a case of how unrealistic US judgments could be. A conflict in which the US did not lose a single soldier in actual fighting was being exaggerated by characters like Dick Cheney as a gargantuan life and death struggle. Absolute nonsense. On page 110, Steve Coll is intellectually dishonest when he states that US suffered 12 military deaths. As a matter of fact, the US did not suffer a single military death due to enemy action, and all 12 US deaths reported by Steve Coll to add some glory to the US conquest of Afghanistan were accidental or friendly fire deaths which had no connection with the real enemy action during the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. Even the CIA ex-military civilian who died at Mazar Sharif died because of his excessive and misplaced zeal and over-enthusiasm. On page 119, Coll discusses erroneous assessments which CIA's Richard Blee foresees as a final battle at Gardez. As a matter of fact, the Taliban had all withdrawn to Pakistan and there was no question of any great battle at Gardez. On page 124, Coll's assertion that few Khad veterans were retained by Engineer Arif is totally erroneous. The Khad and now NDS all along was majority composed of old USSR trained leftist era veterans, and the same situation continues till to date. On page 124, Coll repeats that the CIA's mission was Al-Qaeda. As we saw it, Al-Qaeda was never the key player in Afghanistan. Thus, one can conclude that the CIA's mission in Afghanistan, FPAC, was totally out of touch with harsh battle and on-ground realities. On page 127, Coll admits that the US military military massively exaggerated so-called Al-Qaeda fatal casualties in Operation Anaconda, launched in Shahkot in 2002. In reality, this was a puny operation which much inflated, and the US suffered a very few casualties, not exceeding 8, including friendly fire deaths. On page 128, Coll fallaciously claims that the Kabul suburb Wazir Akbar Khan was named after an Afghan king, whereas Wazir was the son of an Afghan king, Dost Muhammad Khan, and was allegedly poisoned by his own father, Dost Muhammad Khan, as per Afghan historian Qasim Rishtiya, as Dost Muhammad feared that his son was too much anti-British company. There was no British government then. Coll's narrative discusses all along how US decision makers deceived themselves, all along what role the ISI was playing, and failed to arrive at a firm and final resolution. All along they remained indecisive and dumb and uncommittal. On page 151, Coll discusses how Pakistanis were massively inflating coalition support fund bills, and the US was paying them despite fully understanding all the lies and exaggerations. Map on page 162 showing CIA posts is vague and disappointing, and Coles failed to note that US lost maximum soldiers at Shkin post in Paktika simply because it was badly sited. Steve Coll's analysis repeatedly brings out the fact that US indecision and strategic vacillations allowed the ISI to regain the initiative. Steve Coll rightly analyzes Amrullah Saleh as the only key Afghan decision maker who most realistically assessed the ISI role and double game in Afghanistan, but was snubbed and ignored by dumb and irresolute US commanders and decision makers, and finally removed by Karzai. Steve Coll on page 200 brilliantly analyzes that US Ambassador Nancy Powell was a total strategic disaster and a major part of US strategic failure in FPAC. Steve Coll accurately assesses Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad in assessing the Pakistani double game in FPAC. On page 201, Coll is wrong when he states that Pakistan Army action started in Waziristan after the assassination attempt on President Musharraf in December 2003. This is absolute nonsense coming from Steve Coll. As a matter of fact, Musharraf launched an unprovoked action in the Fata Waziristan tribal area in October 2003 as a deception plan to fool the Americans while providing full sanctuary to the vast bulk of the Afghan Taliban in the Pakistani Balochistan. On page 202, Coll is blunt and intellectually honest, where he identifies total CIA intelligence failure, inaccurately assessing ISI complicity in aiding the Afghan Taliban. This is a valuable service to posterity and intelligence history. Coll, however, fails to discuss the hard fact that April 2004 assassination attempt on Musharraf was planned and conceived by lower rank soldiers of Pakistan's elite Special Services Group commandos and included many Pakistan Air Force lower ranks. Page 209 analysis shows how erroneously US fallaciously misperceived insurgents' center of gravity in Pakistan, Fata region, and was totally fooled and deceived by General Musharraf. Steve Coll fails to highlight this hard fact while discussing joint US Pakistani action in Fata against Naik Muhammad. On page 212, Coll rightly assesses the CIA as a confused organization with a hazy and totally fallacious perception, all the time inflating Al Qaeda to massive dimensions and failing to see Taliban as the central strategic issue. On page 216, Coll hits the nail on the head where he finds a confused CIA totally fooled and deceived by Musharraf and is shocked to see a naive CIA so deferent to Musharraf and the ISI. This in reality was the biggest US strategic perceptual failure in US Afghan war, and Coll must be commended here for his intellectual honesty. On page 217, Coll discusses brilliant foresight of Afghan intelligence chief Amrullah Saleh, where Saleh foresaw the Taliban resurgence in 2009. On page 218, Coll brilliantly discusses extreme naivete of Kelly Cullen in dismissing Amrullah Saleh's brilliant assessments about ISI. Kelly Cullen was a total disaster, no doubt. I wonder why the Americans were so naive and foolish to engage him. It is a super mystery why the Americans were so foolish and selecting and handpicking a man like Kelly Cullen to advise them regarding Afghanistan war. Coll discusses in detail how the CIA was repeatedly fooled by the ISI and how CIA naively shared Amrullah Saleh's brilliant Pakistan assessments with the ISI, who simply assigned them straight into the dustbin. In the chapter Digging a Hole in the Ocean, this matter is discussed in considerable detail. Cold discussion of SWAT operation is totally fallacious. Page 310 to 316. Pakistan Army never faced any serious odds in the SWAT operation, and its victory in 2009 was a foregone conclusion. I interviewed Brigadier Ajab Khan, who was deeply involved in the SWAT operation all along. Ajab described in detail how Pakistani generals all along massively lied and exaggerated odds in SWAT to win potential promotions, etc. And some 48 battalions were pitched against a puny force of 1000 to 2000 badly armed insurgents in SWAT. Ajab Khan also narrated of how a famous Pakistani general ordered some 500 airstrikes against a puny rebel force in Bajod and Mohammad's agency. Ajab Khan, an outstanding professional, was passed over and not promoted on totally irrelevant pretext that his wife was a doctor and was working for a US organization, although the Pakistani state was playing concubine to the USA all along, at least outwardly, and milked the USA of some 25 billion US dollars for doing nothing. Coll fails to analyze and note that despite getting over 25 billion US dollars, Pakistan did not deploy a single battalion to interdict 90% of Taliban infiltration in Afghanistan along the entire 1,500 kilometer Balochistan Afghan border. Coll rightly analyzes that the decision to deploy in Helmand had no strategic rationale. Coll's discussion of military operations is sketchy and confused, and the book does not contain a single map to illustrate US military operations of 2009-11. The book is interesting but ends inconclusively. There is no detailed and definite conclusion. Coll is confused and totally vague and unclear about the conclusion of the CIA and the ISI and the Afghan war intelligence games. What we have is an interesting narrative, but no subtle analysis, passing references to US lack of strategic insight, but no details. What Coll fails to admit or openly state as is that the entire US war in Afghanistan was an exercise in massive self deception. Since the USA lacked the strategic resolution to confront the Pakistani state, it fooled itself and its public with vague entities like Al Qaeda, which never was a serious player in the FPAC. Coll refuses to see the hard and harsh picture that 90% US casualties in Afghanistan in actual fighting were caused by the ISI proxies and not Al Qaeda. It is a harsh admission that whole nations and states, and this includes a superpower like the USA, can go on deceiving themselves and their public, and Steve Coll's massive and exhaustive gargantuan book offers no definite conclusion. The book was an interesting but mediocre read. It was necessary to buy this book to review it, and Steve Coll again disappoints me with his typical Washington Post non committal dilly dallying.